Alright, hey everyone. So welcome to the set of videos that I'm going to be doing for Industrial Technology Multimedia. So maybe one of my students, maybe found these on the internet, whatever, I don't care. Basically these videos and the accompanying forms can be used as a complete course refresher if you like. So you can use these as at your own pace, and you can learn everything that you should need to do really well in the theory section of Industrial Technology Multimedia. So keep in mind that these are filmed in 2019, so some of the emerging technology, depending on when you view this, may not really be emerging anymore, and things might change. I'll probably make some amended videos if that needs to happen. But I'm going to go through each section of the syllabus that's relevant, explain it in a fair amount of detail, but I'm going to try and keep each video to sort of 20 minutes. After that, there'll be some questions that are provided in a Google form, at least for the students at my school, and you'll be able to go through them and sort yourself up. They're going to be based on past questions from the HSC, so there's going to be a point to them. Hopefully, if I can be bothered, there's going to be some green screen stuff behind me that further demonstrates the ideas that I'm trying to go through here. The idea of these videos is that you can just really view these and you should be able to pass it. I know that it's hard to find an industrial technology multimedia teacher that actually wants to be one, and if they leave at any certain time, it can be almost impossible to get stuff sorted out. Anyway. All of that's irrelevant. We're going to be going through the syllabus, and in this video, I'm going to start off pretty easy. So I'm going to start off with something that if you've ever used a computer before, you should hopefully know. So on page 41 of the current syllabus that was amended in 2008, there is an industry-related manufacturing technology page. Now this is the focus area for multimedia, HSC, and we're going to start off talking about fonts, okay? So fonts are, well, I mean, you guys should know how to use fonts. You've used a word processor before, and I mean, that is basically what we're working with here. Fonts are a glyph or a picture that we use to represent a particular character in a language. So, for example, the letter A in most Western languages is the same. It's based on really historical artifacts from a long time back. So we've had those sorts of glyphs in our writing, at least since Middle English and before that in various languages. It's a symbol that doesn't actually mean anything. We've just decided that the two diagonal lines with a horizontal line through the middle represents the sound R. Which we then put into our own words, and it's a pictorial representation of that. So a font on a computer is literally a selection of these glyphs in different styles. So Times New Roman, for example, has the same basic font properties to it, and that is how we represent those sorts of things, okay? That was a very confusing way of saying it, but basically a font is just, you know, it's used by a computer to represent letters when you type it in on your keyboard. Okay, so there are three main types of fonts. The first one is a serif font. Now, the way that you can work out a serif font is because it has serifs. Now, what are serifs? They're those little flared bits on the end of the letter. So our idea, and we're not 100% sure on this, where they came from, is to do with back in Roman times and times when they used to carve in the Latin letters onto stone. So by creating a horizontal stripe, for example, before they put the vertical F lying down in the stone, it could stop the marble or the stone from cracking and chipping. So if you've ever tried to carve into stone or wood or anything like that, one of the problems is you can split. When you're carving down a long line, the line can continue, and you don't want that, especially if you're doing something precise like stonework. So we put the serif and we carve across there, and the idea is it'll split, but only to that line. that's the idea of where it comes from. So anyway, serifs are great because they give our eyes something to anchor to. So when we're reading large bodies of text, at least on paper, a serif font is a lot easier to read. So we use this, of course, pardon me about the crack, we use this to, when we're doing body text, so large areas of text in a work would make that work really well, okay? So they kind of look a little bit more classy, a little bit more old school, for want of a better word, and if you want something to look kind of like a fancy wedding invitation or a governmental thing or something that wants authority, you really want to use a serif font. So some common ones for that are Times New Roman, Garamond, Bedoni, so those are really, they look kind of the same, but they have differences in sort of the width of the stroke, so that's called stroke modulation. Times New Roman comes from, it's a Romanesque font, which we go back to the Romans striking into the stone. Obviously made for the Times newspaper in London, well maybe not obviously, but there you go. It's basically what you think of when you think of like that sort of old school font. So it's got that serif, those little arms and legs and feet that come off the edge of the font. Okay, so sans serif is the other main type of font, and that's relatively recent. It doesn't go back to that sort of medieval time. We're kind of going to like the 19th century, early 20th century. Jan Schieshold, typographer, brings out a manifesto called the Nouveau Typography, where he says we don't need these serifs, we need to strip back letter forms to their most basic. Comes out with things like Futura, Gil Sans, so often if you have a font with the word sans at the end of it, it's a sans serif. They're essentially the same as serif fonts in that they can have different stroke width and modulation, but we just need to get rid of those serifs. So the reason that we use them on computers for the majority of time is because when you've got those little fonts, little size, so like 8, 9 point, they're represented by pixels on a computer screen. So if we can get rid of all that, all those extra bits of data, like the little flares again on those Fs and the Rs, they'll take up less pixels, less information, and smaller file size. Also easy to read without those little bits being deformed. It doesn't really matter in new screens, so if you start using your high definition screens, you're not really going to get that sort of an issue, but we say a lower resolution display will have trouble with a serif font, so we use a sans serif. So there is a prevailing idea that sans serif fonts are easier to read on computer, but as computer screens get bigger, we're seeing the difference become negligible, and even kind of the opposite is coming true. So we're going back to those serif fonts being easier to read on a high definition screen. That said, sans serif fonts can look kind of punchy and modern, and they can be used quite well to really not put that air of snootiness and classiness. When we talk about the other type of font, at least the three that are present in the syllabus currently, we've got decorative fonts. Now, decorative fonts are really fonts that are just a bit all over the place. So using the textbook that I provide to my kids, that is a decorative font. So kind of like your script fonts, which emulate running writing. You've got Comic Sans, which is obviously a sans serif because that's the sans after it. What else have you got? You got Papyrus, all that kind of like things that look like certain other things that decorate. As a decorative font, it decorates. Now, you don't want to use these for your body text. So body text is like your paragraphs of writing. If you use one of these fonts, people aren't going to be able to read it. It's going to annoy them. But for headings, it can work really well. So we don't want to make them size 14 point or smaller because it's going to be hard to see those details. Things are going to mush together, and they can be illegible. So they can have extremes in things like X height, which is the height of the sort of the lowercase across there. So if you look at the letter A, that looks like an A to me. It would be, what would it be that way for you? It would be the height of the bowl, so the rounded A there. That would be the X height. Also, the literal height of the X letter is where the name comes from. So you could also have your descenders, which is like the down bit on the P, ascenders, which is the high bit on the H. All of those sorts of things, they might be really exaggerated. It's hard to read, okay? Some people call them titling fonts. In the syllabus it says decorative fonts. Don't use them too much. They kind of suck. If you wanted to create something that looks very beautiful, there is a third option. So this could be an emerging technology. It definitely is at the time that I'm recording this, and that's called SVG Fonts. So SVG Fonts, instead of creating a vector-based glyph, so with points, so we'll talk about vectors later, but it has mathematical points with lines in between them. You can use an SVG font, which is basically a picture. But because it's an SVG, it's scalable. It's still a vector, but it's closer to a JPEG. You know, you can get those sort of shades. You can get various colors in one glyph. So you could use hand-painted type, for example, that shows the bumps, makes it look like it's an artistic thing full of gesso and bumpy and all that sort of stuff. SVG fonts are currently supported in Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator, but not Word, not After Effects or anything like that, but they're working on it. So by the time any of you watch this, maybe it is working in those. Those sorts of things are a really nice way to bring about sort of like hand font. There's a lot of script calligraphy and things like that, and that can work quite well. But yeah, we've talked about the actual fonts now. One of the main things we need to talk about though is obviously legibility and emphasis. Okay, so the most important thing when you're working with fonts is that people can actually read what you've written. Doesn't matter how beautiful it is, if it can't be read, there's no point to the entire thing. Okay, so what we want to do here is we want to talk about the different ways that you can format your fonts. That's the second point in the syllabus here, and we go and talk about the essential parts of that. So when you're creating a font as a font designer, usually you'll create glyphs or the letter forms in different weights. So you might choose to create a bolder version of it. So bold is used for emphasis. So when you want something to stand out punchy on the page, if you use it all over the place, it doesn't work. Okay, it's like anything. It's like when you highlight an entire page of text and nothing becomes highlighted. But bold has a strong, vivid, or clear appearance on a page. And you can think of it like putting a line around text, like an outline, but it's not actually an outline. If you've ever put a font into Illustrator and then just done a line color and changed the line point up, you'll see that it's not it doesn't look right. So a bold font is actually drawn from scratch to still have the same kind of font appearance as the normal letter forms, but it pops out, so they'll use a thicker line for most of the weighting of it, okay? It works really well for emphasis, that I've said. Italic is where you slope it. So the usual slope is about 15 degrees. Some programs will let you slope it more than that, but after a time it just kind of becomes sideways text and you can't read anything, and you've got legibility issues with that. So italics, Italian letter forms, sloping, we don't need to go into the detail of why that's a thing, but yeah. Underlined, it's when you put a line under your text. Emphasis, okay? I mean, if you don't know what underlining something is, you're in year 12, you know, we can work with that. So let's talk about alignment. So there's 4 types of alignment in most word processors. You've got left align, center align, right align, and justified. Left align moves all the text that you've selected over to the left side of your page, which is the conventional way that we read in Western society. So every line will start on the left side, it'll go to left side, it'll go to wherever it is that you want to enter in the line. You hit enter, it moves back to the left, and it just continues down in a line. Okay, it's the easiest to read. Now, the reason why it's the easiest to read is because our eyes adjust to that harsh line at the end, and when we get to the end of the line, we see it there, and we move back as a starting point. It's debatable about whether there's actually any medical reason for the way that works, but it just works easier for us because it's the way that our brains have been conditioned. Conversely, if you look at sort of Chinese and Asian type, which runs in the other direction, they would find that much easier. Okay, so anyway, in Western society, left align type is the easiest to read. Center align type you really want to use sparingly. The reason for center align type being used sparingly is when you have different line lengths, it can be hard to find the start of each line. So it's going to be harder to read large amounts of text. It works really well though if you want to have maybe a contents page or something that has emphasis to it, but you really want to avoid it because unless there's a reason for it. With all of these rules that I'm going to say in these videos, it's not like you can't do it, you just have to make sure that there's a particular reason for what you're doing. Right aligned text is aligned on the right. So it goes over to the right side. All of those lines to the end of your line is a straight line, and then the start of your line is all jagged all over the place. I don't know why you would ever use that, but it's an option. I don't know, maybe you want to do it for some idea that you've got. The final one is justified text. Don't use it. So what justified text does is it makes sure that the left and the right side are a straight block of text, and then it separates out the letters to make sure that it's kind of evenly averaged over that line. So some lines will have their kerning close together. So kerning is the space between letters in programs like InDesign, After Effects, or InDesign, Photoshop, and Illustrator. You can hold down the Option key or the Alt key, and you can change how close or far letters are apart. So it'll kind of pull those letters apart to make sure that the left and the right side are equal. So don't use it, all right? Just please. The reason why I say it is because it makes it impossible to read. Once you pull letters apart to like 100 point, you don't really register in your brain as words anymore. You just start registering it as letters. Any more than that, it just starts being ridiculous. If you really, really want those hard edges on the side of your paragraphs, you should do it manually. Okay, even if it's not perfectly done, you can kern larger spaces. You can kern your words just a little bit so they still work. Try not to use justified text, please. But whatever. Once again, you do what you want to do. All right. So how does a computer even store type? So basically, we've got a binary message, which is sort of a 1 and a 0, however many. I can't off the top of my head think of how you represent an A in binary text. And essentially, when we hit the note on the keyboard, binary represents it. The glyph comes up. It's a little picture, a really low quality vector image that can be scaled to multiple sizes without pixelating, and then it does what it does and represents it on screen. Moving on. So we've talked about alignment. We can talk about indents. So an indent is best represented probably by suggesting the tab key. So when you tab, it moves over just a little bit. That's an indent. It's kind of like a push-in, so an indentation on something. You can use it for lists and emphasis and all sorts of things like that, and it'll draw people's attention to stuff if used sparingly. Bullet points, obviously, just a dot. We program in those glyphs and things of that nature, and we make it work. It's a bullet point, all right? You can use an asterisk, you can use any sort of stuff there. Moving on to numbers, you know what a number is at this point, all right? I don't need to explain what these are. So I'm just going through everything in the syllabus, but I'm gonna spend more time on certain things than other ones, okay? Moving on to sizing. So sizing is actually a really complicated idea in fonts because you may have noticed that there's not a lot of difference between 11 point and 12 point. There's more difference between 8 point and 12 point than 12 point and 16 point, even though they're both 4 points apart. It's because it's relative. So the actual sizing of things is called EMs. So it's a unit of typographic measurements. And the EM was originally a reference to the width of the capital M in a typeface. Often it's the same as the point size, but it's not necessarily the same. So point size is 1 point is about 0.0353 millimeters. So the way that we work that out is that 1 point type should be 0.35 millimeters on page, and it scales up like that. But point size varies. So in the 18th century, it was 0.18 of a millimeter was a point, and it's 0.4-ish today. So point size is not, if you really need to know the exact size, it doesn't really work out too well for you. So 1 EM, the way that we can work that out is and to size things up, if you really need to know, you go the desired pixel value divided by the inherited pixel value equals the EM value. Don't even worry about it, all right? We're just talking about font size here. All we need to know for the HSC is that the bigger the size of a font, the bigger it's going to be on a page. So 12-point font is your default, but most books are sort of 8 to 10 font because 12 is too big. 12 is what we usually recommend for projects and things like that, but it can seem a bit large on the page. Any more than that, and our head starts to get confused by big lines of text as words sort of go and hyphenate over to different lines. What we need to think about is the reason why 10 to 12 point works is because there's an ideal number of words on a page and an ideal number of words on a line. If you do any more than that amount of words on a line, then it starts to confuse your brain. So some smart people out there have worked out that that's the ideal number of words per line, and we just kind of go with it, okay? When we're talking about font colors, I'm going to move on. You can use it to convey meaning. So making some words red on a page of black type will make it stand out. But color in fonts can create issues of contrast. So let's say you have some green words, some red words, and then you just happen to have your page read by someone with red-green color blindness. So they're not going to know the difference between those two things at all. They might even see them as shades of black and completely miss it. So you have to be careful with color and emphasis. It's really best if you can keep your font one color and do any emphasis or changes with underlines, bolds, and italics, just to think of people with different abilities and disabilities. You also, when you start using colors in text, you've got to think about like backgrounds and things like that. You've got to think about the fact that a computer represents RGB color, but a printer prints out CMYK color, which means you might have completely different colors when you print things out. It's usually best not to use it unless you really need to sort of come up with an idea. Also, using reverse color text, so having a colored background with white text on it is a minefield of legibility issues, especially at small sizes. Anyway, whatever. We're going to move on to kerning, which isn't in the syllabus, but I think it needs to be said. So kerning is the space between two letters. You can apply it manually. It really just helps with legibility. So when you type a word, the computer organizes the spacing in between it by what it thinks is the best use. So it puts in an algorithm and it usually works pretty okay. Now, if you're doing headings, sometimes if you actually look at something and look at the typography between it, you can see like the T might be too far away from the O. So the reason for that is because an O is this shape, a T is this shape, and when the space in between it is pretty much the same as a T and a let's see, this would be a B for you. So if a T and a B are together, they might be quite close together, but if you've got a B here and then you put an O next to it, there might be like a large space between it. It might look strange. So you can hold down the Option or the Alt key and you can manually make those closer or further apart. And yeah, so manual kerning is something that you might want to do. Ligatures, if we talk quickly about them as well, because I think they're important. A ligature is when you combine two letters together automatically. So I think a T and an H will sometimes combine together. I can't think of any other ligatures. Okay, so double A's can sometimes get combined together. A and an E can get combined together. Two F's can get combined together. So as an example with the F's, so you've got the F shape, it comes in, the other one, it'll connect those two horizontal lines together and it'll just give you one glyph, so a double F. That can make the actual the text read clearer. Okay, so a ligature is when the computer automatically combines letters together. Now, some fonts do that. The problem with that is, let's say you use a ligature in Microsoft Word, copy and paste that body of text over to Google Docs. Those ligatures will start turning up as squares because they're not written into the Google Docs form. Something to think about, okay? So we've got kerning, which is the space between single letters. Tracking is the overall space in between all of the letters together. So when we're talking about justifying and kerning, you could say that that's tracking. So a wider tracked heading would be much further apart, much more space in between the letters. So we don't want to add too much of that. Okay. We're going to talk about, just quickly, stroke and fill. So a stroke is the line around a shape. So if you were to make a square, you could have the actual line of the square, that would be called the stroke, and then the color inside that would be called the fill. So if we had a red rectangle with a black outline, it would have a black stroke and it would have a red fill. When we talk about stroke and fill, when we talk about images and especially vectors, that will become more important. Okay. Headings and subheadings, so you understand what a heading is. You're in year 12. A heading is at the start of a paragraph or a title of something. It tells you what it's going to be about. A subheading is another heading that's further down that's less important. So I could say that the heading for these videos would be Industrial Technology Multimedia, and the subheading, which is this particular video today, would be about fonts and paragraphing and pagination. Okay, so when we talk about subheadings, there's various rules that you can talk about. So those would be on page 7 of the 2018-2019 Year 12 textbook. You can look into that, you'll do fine. Also the rules, just break them, it doesn't matter. Just as long as your headings are smaller than your subheadings and you can tell that they're not as important as the main heading, you should do fine, okay? They're suggested rules, but once again, break them. And I think the final thing that I'm going to talk about today is formatting paragraphs and pagination. Okay, so when you've got a paragraph, it's important that you leave some space in between so it doesn't look like a run-on sentence. So what is a paragraph? A paragraph is a chunk of text that usually represents a single idea. So what you want to do with that sort of thing is you want to make sure that the people that are reading it can see the differences in those chunks of text. So you might want to add in you hit enter to leave some space in between your paragraphs. You might want to add an indent to certain paragraphs. You might want to have the paragraphs spaced further apart. So most of the time it's single line spacing, but you might want to change it to 1.5 paragraph spacing. You could add an indent so you could push the next paragraph in if it's kind of like a subheading point of that paragraph. There's lots of ways that we can make paragraphs stand out. The most important thing is just leave that line in between your paragraphs of text, especially if you're using a computer, because that way we can register it. It's kind of an accepted rule at this point. Pagination. So pagination is something that you might not have heard about before, but it's the way that you set out a document. So if you look at a book that's bound properly, so not just stapled like this, you notice that an A4 book is actually made up of A3 pages that are folded in half, and then they put the binding down they put the binding down the edge of it, and that's how they make the book. So an A5 book is made up of A4 pieces of paper, so we've got our A4 piece of paper, they fold it in half, you've got your A5 book. So when we print that out, and when it's organized, you don't actually print it out in order. So using this again, if I had this and it was an A3 book, I would have the last page and the front page printed out on the same page, and then I'd have the inner page here and I'd have the back page of this one printed out on the same A3 piece of paper. Now, how do we organize that? Do we organize that manually? No, we get a computer program to do it for us. Now, InDesign will automatically paginate for you. I'm not sure if other programs will do it or you have to do it manually, but you should be using InDesign if you're creating books anyway. At this point in time, there's not really anything better for that. So pagination can also be the consecutive page number of pages, and that comes about in like the year 1500. So that's an interesting fact. Before 1500, there's no page numbers. So whatever. have a newspaper, when we have a book or anything, page numbers are really important because helps us find where we've left our place. If we don't have a bookmark, if a page falls out, you know, it's also good to have that. I think that's really all I need to talk about in this lesson. So what have we gone over? We've gone over fonts, we've gone over formatting of text, we've talked about kerning, tracking, pagination. It's really a very simple lesson, but there's a lot of stuff there that you can get tripped up on. Now, where is this going to be in the test? You're going to get this in multiple choice, and you're going to get this in short answer. So you might get asked a question where a multiple choice question where they show you a body, like a sentence, and there'll be some writing, and there'll be something bold, there'll be something underlined, and they'll go like, what are the features of text formatting that are shown here? Very simple question. You probably don't even need to know that if you've used a computer before. Short answer, they might talk about adding ways that you could add emphasis to text. They might give you a font and say, what type of font is this? Is this a sans serif font, a serif font, or a decorative font, or just some made up fourth option? Those are probably the things you're going to get. Okay, so if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments or email me or whatever it is. We'll move on to the next thing as needed. And yeah, good luck.